Welcome to Debate the News True Crime. I'm Joseph Lobosco, joined by host Adrienne Barker. And tonight we've got a special guest host with us, the fabulous Vashon. We're diving into one of the darkest chapters in American legal history, the execution of George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old from South Carolina who, in 1944, became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century.
Before we begin, we want to remind listeners that this episode contains descriptions of violence against children and capital punishment. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know needs support, help may be available via the Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. We approach this story with respect for all the victims. May they rest in peace.
Adrienne, Vashon, and I are not attorneys or law enforcement officials. We research each case thoroughly, but this show is recorded live with minimal editing. Any factual errors are unintentional. And any individuals we discuss who haven't been convicted of a crime or whose convictions were later vacated are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. The opinions of our guests and audience members are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of myself, Adrienne, Vashon, or Debate the News.
This case isn't just about one tragedy. The story of George Stinney Jr. reveals how racial bias, rush justice, and the absence of due process can destroy a life. Tonight, we are going to walk you through the events of 1944, the decades-long silence that followed, and the eventual 2014 court ruling that finally cleared his name. 70 years too late.
It's March 1944 in the segregated mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina. The community is divided by railroad tracks, white families on one side, black families on the other. On March 23rd, two white girls, Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7, set out on their bicycles looking for wildflowers. They never came home. The next day, a search party forms. Among them is George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old black boy who lives nearby with his parents and siblings. He mentioned that he and his little sister saw the girls earlier that day.
The following morning, March 24th, their bodies are found in the shallow ditch near the black section of town. Both had been beaten to death with what investigators describe as a heavy metal railroad spike or a piece of iron. The small town erupts in panic and anger, and within hours, police turn their suspicion on George Stinney Jr., simply because he was reportedly the last person to have seen the girls alive.
It is crucial to note the context here. This is the Jim Crow South. Racial segregation is law, and lynchings are still a grim reality. Instead of investigating broadly, officers go straight to the Stinney home. With George's parents away, the police take George Jr. and his brother Johnny into custody in front of their terrified younger siblings. 14-year-old George, 5'1" and barely 95 pounds, is then interrogated alone for hours. No lawyer, no guardian, no written record of what was said. Authorities later claimed he confessed, even describing a supposed sexual motive. Yet, there's no sign or written confession and no physical evidence.
By that evening, George is in jail, completely isolated. Word spreads and a white mob gathers, threatening to lynch him. Officials quietly move him to a jail 2 counties away to prevent mob violence. Meanwhile, the Stinney family is forced to flee town after George's father is fired from his job. They leave everything behind, livestock, belongings, their home, just to survive.
Less than a month later, on April 24th, 1944, George Stinney Jr. goes on trial for murder. The proceedings last barely 2 hours. The courtroom is packed with 1,500 white spectators. Black residents, including George's family, are not allowed inside. The entire jury is white and male. George's court-appointed defense attorney, a local tax commissioner with no experience in capital cases, calls no witnesses presents no evidence, and barely cross-examines the state witnesses. The prosecution case rests entirely on the sheriff's word that George confessed. There are no fingerprints, no blood evidence, no weapon.
This trial violated nearly every standard of due process. There was no meaningful defense, no opportunity to challenge the confession, and no time for investigation. Even under 1940s law, the speed of this case was extreme. And after just 10 minutes of deliberation, the jury returns a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentences him to death by electrocution.
The execution date is set for June 16, 1944, only 83 days after the murders. There's no appeal, his lawyer doesn't even file one, and requests for clemency to South Carolina's governor are ignored.
On the morning of the execution, George is led into the death chamber at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. He's so small, the guards have to stack a Bible on the chair as a booster seat. Witnesses later recall that when the first 2400-volt surge hit, the adult-sized mask slipped off his face, revealing his terrified eyes. And it only took minutes. George Stinney Jr., 14 years old, was pronounced dead, the youngest person executed in the United States in modern history.
The case disappears from national hotlines almost immediately, and for decades, it's remembered only locally. A whispered reminder of the Jim Crow era. But within the Black community of Alcolu, George's surviving siblings never stop insisting on his innocence.
Fast forward to the early 2000s, a local historian, George Frierson, begins researching the case and pushing for a retrial. By 2013, attorneys take up the cause pro bono, filing a motion to vacate George's conviction. They argue he was denied his constitutional rights and likely coerced into confessing.
In January of 2014, Circuit Judge Carmen T. Mullen holds a 2-day hearing, essentially a posthumous retrial. George's sisters testify that he was with them watching the family cow the day the girls disappeared, far from the crime scene. Expert witnesses explain how a 14-year-old in 1944 would have been especially vulnerable to coercion during police interrogation. The defense also points out the complete lack of physical evidence and the attorney's failures to mount any defense.
The hearing underscores the systemic failures. The state argues that standards were different then, but Judge Mullen sees it differently. In December 2014, she issues a 29-page order vacating George Stinney's conviction. She writes that his trial was a truly unfortunate episode in our history, citing fundamental violations of due process. She finds the alleged confession highly suspect and condemns the defense attorney's inaction as the essence of ineffective assistance.
70 years after his execution, George Stinney Jr. is officially exonerated. His siblings, now in their 70s and 80s, finally hear the words they've waited a lifetime for. Catherine Stinney Robinson later says, quote, "He was a child who didn't have a chance, but at least now people know the truth."
The exoneration reignited public conversation around race, juvenile justice, and the death penalty. George Stinney's name has since become a symbol of wrongful conviction and racial injustice. His story is now cited in legal reform discussions, taught in university courses, and featured in documentaries highlighting miscarriages of justice.
While George Stinney's case did not directly result in specific legal reforms, it remains a stark illustration of why protections like recorded interrogations for minors and stronger standards for legal defense in capital cases are vital. His story reminds us that the death penalty, once imposed, is irreversible, and that due process must shield the most vulnerable, especially our children.
Beyond the courtroom, George Stinney's story has echoed in American culture. Commentators have noted striking parallels between his case and Stephen King's The Green Mile and its 1999 Academy Award nominated film adaptation.
In the film, John Coffey, a black man falsely accused of murdering two white girls in the Deep South, faces a racially biased system and execution by electric chair. The helplessness on the last walk and the moral horror of executing the innocent all resonate with the historical record of Stinney's ordeal.
The Green Mile was a reflection of real miscarriage of justice from that era. The film's global reach helped embed those themes: racial bias, wrongful conviction, the irreversible finality of capital punishment in public consciousness.
All right, let's open this up for discussion and debate. This is obviously a horrible case. It's so disturbing that this happened. We just want to welcome Vashon, who is our guest co-host for the night. She's the one who brought forth this case. I'm so glad she did. Do you want to share your reactions about this case or why you picked it?
What amazed me most about this case was the perceptions of the girl's family today. I was just in absolute disbelief, and I really want to get into that in this conversation because they are holding firm, not all of them, but some of them are holding firm in regards to his conviction and his execution.
I absolutely do not think that he did it. It wouldn't make sense to me. So, Vashon, this case, I'm really glad you're talking about it because I want to know how far we've come since 1944.
Absolutely. It is definitely a heartbreaking story. I am a person who is anti-capital punishment for this exact reason. The finality of putting someone to death, you cannot reverse that. And it doesn't matter if it happened to a million people, 1,000 person, or one person. You know, my grandmother was born a year before this happened in 1943. And we think that was a long time ago, and it wasn't. My grandmother passed away a few years ago at 75 years of age. And it wasn't that long ago. And, we have come further. We have come far, but that doesn't mean the progress we made cannot be unraveled. And we are seeing some of that. This family was forced to leave the area because they were afraid of being lynched. People say it was the times, but was it the times or was it the people? Does times change our human nature that much? Does it matter that it was 1944? I don't think it does, because I think given the opportunity and the legal pathway to do it, people would do the same exact thing today. I don't think the heart and nature of people necessarily changes just because times have changed it. Only thing that has to change is the heart. When we see the heart of man change, then, we can say times have changed. I am just so perplexed about, even during this time, how this happened, because there was no reason. I mean, this young man joins the search party. Remember, no one knows the girls are dead, okay? People go missing all the time, okay? So think about that. Think about that in context. Someone goes missing. What do you want to do? You want to give them any information they need so they can be found, because they may not have been murdered or kidnapped. They could have simply lost their way, or something could have happened to them medically, or whatever the case may be. So here you have George, and they asked him, have you seen the girls? Yes, me and my sister saw her earlier. We saw them earlier. They were looking for these Maypops. And this is where we saw them. This is all they had to go on. Explain to me, how do you get to the point where convicted of murder, electrocuted in 83 days, Deliberation in 2.5 hours, no cross-examinations or anything of that nature. And even all these years later, some of those girls' family members are still sticking to their story.
Yeah, Vashon, it's absolutely baffling how they jumped to that conclusion and made that leap from, okay, he was the last person to see her, presumably, or one of the last people to see her, to he's now being accused of her murder, let alone being convicted of it and then executed. It's a leap that really makes no logical sense whatsoever.
Thank you, Vashon, for bringing this case. This case really is very sad. One thing that crushes me is the fact that there was no one to defend this kid when it came to pulling him into interrogation with no adult in the room. I mean, think about it. He was 14 years old. He was a child still, right? And there was no one to defend him. Everyone was against this kid. No one saying, wait a minute, let's look for the evidence. He had no blood on him. There was no weapon found, no evidence, no DNA, obviously no DNA at the time, but not real evidence to accuse this kid, a 14-year-old of his size. Do you think he really had the strength to kill both of them at the same time and to get away with it? That's crazy to me. Then no one thought of that and then no one came to his rescue. Like everyone was just against him for no reason, just because of the color of his skin. Yeah, that's the truth. Because at that time, when it comes to socializing, they can socialize together. That was not allowed. So, in my opinion, this was racially profiled. This 14-year-old skinny kid. How in the world can you think this kid can murder two other kids by himself? They decided that he did it and they decided to take his life. That's pretty sad. And Vashon, I agree with you. If these people, up to this day, still in their heart, they believe that this kid did this, we are not far from that event. Now, this can happen again if we let it. They did whatever they wanted to do with this kid and they killed him. That's what they did. That's what happened. I'm going to stop right there.
Marianne, I'm glad you brought up details about the possibility of whether or not he could have committed this crime. George Stinney was 14. The girls were 11 and 8. And at the time, he stood about 5 feet, 1 inches, and he weighed approximately 90 to 95 pounds. They originally said that he confessed that this was sexually motivated. They found the girls with their hymens intact. They suffered severe blunt force trauma to their heads with a heavy, blunt weapon described as a metal rod or a railroad spike. So experts have actually questioned whether a boy of Stinney's size and strength could actually inflict those injuries. And there's no physical evidence actually tying him to the crime scene, to their bodies, or to the murder weapon, okay? A former cellmate of Stinney's also reported that Stinney consistently denied the charges, underscoring his innocence. And his family had the same consistent story at the time in the moment of question that he was home with them. So he had an alibi and he was actually accounted for. So I'm just glad that you brought up those things because physically there was nothing that suggests that he could have done this.
You know, as I listen to this, the thing that crosses my mind more so than anything, as we look at what's going on right now in our country, I believe this will happen today, given the environment that we're in and given the leadership that we have. I believe this is well, attempting to be happen again today, at least I should say, because I think a lot of people would make excuses when we say, hey, he couldn't have done it. They're like, well, how do you know? Because in our discourse that we have with people, I'm finding out that people are quite different than you believe them to be. I thought that was a bygone era. And, through my interaction, just talking to people around the country when we do our shows and speaking, it's not a bygone era. They speak about the crime rate amongst African Americans, representing 36% of crime, but only having 13% of the population. But then you got to go look at the high rate of exoneration. Over 50% of the exonerees are African Americans. There's definitely still something broken there. I think what happened to George back then is in some way what is happening during these times right now. When you look at the high rate of incarceration, you look at the Central Park Five, you look at these cases that have been jaw dropping. People have served time. People are going to prison. Central Park Five, they didn't get out on appeal, folks. They actually served their time and were paroled before they were found not to be guilty. So I just want to put that out there. Listening to this before, when I used to hear these stories, I used to say, thank God that era is over. I no longer believe that. Alan.
That's a great point, JB. I absolutely agree with you. I question too, how far have we come? Let's bring it to Nuala.
I agree with Jonathan. These things are still happening today. What's really fascinating about this is that the girl's family, 70 years later, like generations on, are insisting that he did it. I think I would rather try to discover whether George Stinney actually did it, if there was any proof, or who did it. Or let's go down that way. I don't understand. Have they been interviewed to say why they're so convinced that it was true? Have they been interviewed?
Oh, no, absolutely. They have been interviewed. Many of them are standing strong on the fact that they believe he was guilty, but some of them acknowledge that he should have got life in prison or that there was some injustice in how it was carried out. However, there are a few family members, including a niece of Betty June Binnicker, and she has come out and publicly expressed disappointment at the court's ruling vacating his conviction. Her reason for this is that some police officer told her, "You never believed that that boy didn't kill your aunt." And this is what she said. She believes that the public narrative has often been one-sided, portraying Stinney as a poor, pitiful little Black boy unjustly, whereas her family holds a contrary view. But they never really go into great detail, like, as to why, right? They're very, like, loose statements I have heard. So she acknowledges that he was treated unfairly by the legal system, but, that's pretty much it. Also, there was a supposed deathbed confession from another man allegedly admitting to the murders. And they also believe that the murders probably did not take place where the girls were found, that their bodies were moved. Okay. And if there was any physical evidence of that, that definitely would have ruled him out. I don't think they got to that point. But there was another man that supposedly confessed, and there's a local historian, his name is George Frierson, and he mentioned that there's a guy by the name of George Washington Burke who was the actual culprit, and he was some son of a wealthy family that might have been involved. So I do want to highlight a few things since we're talking about the miscarriage of justice. I want to talk about why this matters today, because this happens in real time, meaning people are convicted and executed in real time based on assumptions that they have done something. We've gone through that with the number of police shootings and brutality cases over the years. And if you don't connect with that, then you're no better than the people of that time, right? You just live in a different time and you have the same mindset and mentality when these things happen. I get really nervous sometimes. It's particularly for Black men when it comes to these things, because we've seen these things happen even in this day. And studies shows that Black defendants are disproportionately sentenced to death compared to the population size and relative to that of white defendants. This is how you know that times have not changed, is that in recent years, 86 to 88% of executions involved at least one white victim. Did you hear that? 86 to 88% involves at least one white victim. So is this thing still happening today? Absolutely. Maybe not as egregious, maybe not as over the top, because yes, people have to be more clever as far as how they perform a miscarriage of justice than in 1944, but it still happens today. And I would love for somebody to challenge me on that.
All right, guys, that concludes part 1 of our George Stinney Jr. true crime episode. We will be back on Tuesday with part 2. Until then, stay safe and have a great weekend. Good night.